Good morning, and welcome to our policy forum entitled An October Surprise with Iran, Calculations and Policy Implications. I'm joined today by three sterling experts on all things Iran, who will help us explore the question of whether or not, as the US enters the final weeks of a very contested, somewhat turbulent presidential campaign, whether or not we can expect or will be surprised by something from Iran, from the regime. This has been, by all measures, one of the most turbulent periods in US-Iranian relations, this past period of a year and a half, when we've seen the Trump administration's efforts at maximum pressure campaign with the stated aim of driving Iranian energy exports to zero, produced last summer a whole series of thinly veiled attacks by Iran on US partners and allies, and finally, through proxies in Iraq at the end of December 2019, attacks that resulted in the death of an American, which precipitated a whole series of other events, culminating in the US targeted killing of IRGC Quds commander Qasem Soleimani, as well as Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, his comrade in arms and Iraq's most powerful militia commander. So we are looking today at the issues surrounding this dynamic between Washington and Tehran, and whether we can, in fact, as was feared some 40 years ago during another presidential campaign between Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. There were concerns on the part of the Reagan campaign that, in effect, there would be an October surprise that would in some way tilt the campaign in Jimmy Carter's favor. But in the end, of course, it worked quite against Jimmy Carter, and the hostages were held and released after Carter's defeat. So today I'm going to turn first to our colleague at the Washington Institute, Mehdi Khalaji, to explore the internal scene and specifically the dynamics in the regime, and to give us his perspective on how the Supreme Leader himself, as well as other elements of the regime, are looking at the US electoral landscape, and to explore, offer his analysis in terms of whether we can expect a greater degree of risk-taking from the regime. Over to you, Mehdi.
Thank you, Barbara, and hello to everyone. I'm trying to focus on 3 points which I think are important to understand the situation in Iran, and this is my own understanding of the situation. First of all, I think that the negotiation with the United States has become inevitable for Iran. So no matter who's gonna win the election in Washington, or who's gonna win election, the presidential election next year in Iran, there will be a negotiation, a serious negotiation between Iran and United States. This urge has become impossible to be neglected. The situation in Iran is very bad economically and psychologically. People are extremely desperate. Every day they wake up with breaking news about the devaluation of the national currency and various kinds of problems, and they blame the government and even the state media frequently and systematically attack on the President Rouhani for his incompetence in dealing with the economic situation. Second, I think that the main power circles in Iran, they have an ambivalent attitude toward the presidential election in Iran, in the United States. On one hand, they would love to embarrass Mr. Trump by any means, you know, even either to see him defeated by Mr. Biden, or some scandal comes up. they want him to be embarrassed, and they are looking for some sort of leverage if Mr. Trump gets elected, or he gets defeated by Mr. Biden. So it would be, in terms of the Islamic Republic's face, it would be a little bit easier for Iran to negotiate with Biden. But it doesn't mean that it is impossible for them to negotiate with Trump. And even I would say that they prefer to negotiate with Republicans, not necessarily Trump, but they prefer to negotiate with Republicans rather than Democrats. Why is that? For several reasons. One is that Iran does not want to repeat the experience they had with Mr. Obama. And any future deal that they're looking for to sign with United States, they want to make sure that Republicans are supporting it, or Israel and Saudi Arabia, special allies of United States in the region, they support this deal. So it's very important for them to see that Republicans are backing such a future deal. So yes, in terms of Islamic Republic face, it's better to see for them Mr. Biden gets elected. But in terms of the sustainability of the deal, they prefer to talk with Republicans. And the last point is that the Iranian society has very little stomach for another big shock. So there are several indications which shows that the government is well aware of this, and they are trying to prevent any possibility for another shock. From the assassination of General Soleimani to the way the COVID-19 crisis is going on in Iran. People are in recent months have been somehow dealing with consequent shocks, and it made the society very fragile. And I just give you an example. A few days ago, the Imam of Friday prayer in Isfahan has said something against women and hijab, and said that the society should be, in talking with the chief of police, he said that we have to make the society unsafe for women who do not respect hijab. So that was followed by a big backlash by the society, especially on social media. And in a very rare example and precedent, Imam Jum'eh has come publicly and denied what he said. And he said that, no, the society should be safe for everyone and so on. So the society is in a very fragile situation. And I don't think that if Iran is looking for some sort of surprise deliberately, immediately, and directly. On the opposite, I think they may facilitate, or they may give some advantages to the United States in order to pave the way for the next negotiations. They might agree on something in Iraq. They might agree in the solution of Hashd Shabi. They might do something even crazier in order to make the future negotiations successful. So this is the situation in Iran. And I think in any case, if Ayatollah Khamenei decide to negotiate, the existing or the previous negotiation team will be out of game. Neither Rouhani nor Zarif, there will not be Khamenei is representative in this election, in these negotiations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mehdi. And I overlooked what I should have done as moderator, which was to give a brief intro to each of my guests. That was Mehdi Khalaji. He is the Levitsky Fellow at the Washington Institute, an former Iranian journalist and Qom-trained theologian. Now I'm going to, and I will come back to your very interesting comments on Iraq in particular, Mehdi, when we get into a discussion. I'd like to now turn to Ariane Tabatabai, the Middle East Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, who is going to take us through, I hope, some of the issues she explored in in a very interesting piece she did recently, publication on Iran's influence operations, and give us an evaluation both of, again, your sense of your assessment of risk from the regime's standpoint, its risk appetite, and also the tools that you see the regime having used and potentially using again in this final endgame of the US elections. Go ahead, Ariane.
Well, first of all, Ambassador, thank you so much. And thanks to the Washington Institute for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on a panel with Mike and Mehdi. So actually, I agree with everything Mehdi just outlined. So it'll be very easy to build on what he's said so far. I think that Iran so far is quite happy to actually sit back a little bit and wait and see what happens in our elections in just 27 days, and do so with a fairly minimal involvement. In my mind, what the chief objective right now is to preserve the status quo. And to continue to maintain a certain amount of pressure on the United States, but while trying to avoid, not provoke, sort of an October surprise, if you will. So what does that mean? In practice, Iran has been doing a number of things, and I'm going to outline a few of them. But as importantly, in my mind, it has avoided doing a number of things that it could have done or it could be doing, precisely to make sure that it's not sort of escalating tensions to a level that we saw, for example, in 2019, that it is not provoking some sort of response from the United States this close to the elections. So the first thing that Iran has been doing, it's been very active in terms of information manipulation operations. And, there's a number of crises that are obviously ongoing here in the United States and internationally that have fed directly into Iran's malign influence operations. And that includes the COVID crisis, where Iran, along with Russia and China, has been kind of pushing a lot of disinformation, a lot of conspiracy theories. It's by no means the only actor doing that, but it's been doing a lot of it and often sort of amplifying content that has been put out by both Russia and China on this topic. And the second one that I think is worth outlining is the racial justice protests and the sort of tensions around that here in the United States. Iran has a long track record of trying to weigh in on this topic. For it to sort of advance its own objectives. I should add that actually we've been tracking this issue. We haven't seen a ton of sort of evidence that it's been engaging in disinformation, but we've certainly seen it amplify different sides of the sort of this topic, this issue. And going back to 2014, 2015, when the first round of Black Lives Matter protests started to happen, key Iranian officials, including the Supreme Leader, were weighing in, and this time around was no exception. They were again very active, along with Russia and China, especially at the peak of the sort of protests over the summer. So that's been part of what Iran has been doing. The aims are similar to what to those of Russia and China. Of course, the point is to try to amplify divisions that already exist within the United States, to exacerbate by the sort of very stark partisan divide that exists in the United States. And I think ultimately, actually, one of the main objectives is to discredit democracy as a form of government not just internationally, but also at home, right? I mean, Mehdi mentioned the discontent that exists within Iran, the protests that we've been seeing. And, you know, if you're a government that fails to provide a positive model, that is unable to address your population's grievances, what do? You try to discredit the other models of government that exist. And I think that is a big driver behind Iran's disinformation and information manipulation efforts. The second thing I want to quickly outline is Iranian cyber activities that we've seen. You know, there have been at least 2 attempts that we know of hacking the Trump campaign. We don't really know what the aim was there, whether they were trying to sort of hack and leak, or if they were just trying to collect information. But nonetheless, there have been active attempts by Iran, again, like Russia and China, to hack into campaigns and try to kind of get involved in the electoral process here in the United States. There have also been other attempts by Iran on the World Health Organization in the middle of a global pandemic. There have also been attempts to hack various private sector companies like Gilead, that is one of the main companies that is sort of engaged in the race for developing a vaccine for COVID-19. And of course, those of us who work at think tanks and other institutions, research institutions, academic institutions, are also familiar with the attempts to kind of engage in hacking and cyber activities on all kinds of research institutions here in the United States. So that's a second category of activities that Iran has been taking. The third one, which I won't kind of get into too much because I think Mike will be touching on this a lot more, is of course Iran's ongoing proxy activities in Iraq specifically, which most recently have led to this whole conversation about whether or not the United States should shutter its embassy in Baghdad. Since 2019, there's been, it seems, an uptick in proxy activities in Iraq, designed in part, especially since the killing of Soleimani in January, designed to kind of send a message to the United States that its forces, its diplomats, its interests will not be secure in Iraq and in the region more broadly. And that's sort of how I see also the harassment of the US Navy in the Persian Gulf. But as I mentioned, I think there is also an interesting side, which is what Iran is not doing and it could be doing. And I think the main example here is Iran's nuclear activities. I mean, there's a lot that Iran could be doing to sort of further increase pressure when it comes to the nuclear file. But I think in part it has chosen not to take more actions on that front since a few months ago. Of course, it's continuing to violate the JCPOA, but it hasn't taken additional steps, I think in part because it wants to preserve the status quo. It wants to keep the Europeans on board with the JCPOA. It wants to kind of keep the JCPOA on life support to see what happens in November. And as Mehdi was mentioning, whether it would be dealing with a President Biden or a second President Trump term, because those would provide Iran with fundamentally different environments. And I again agree with Mehdi that inevitably we'll see negotiations, but how those negotiations happen will be very different depending on who's president in just a few months. So that's sort of the main things I wanted to outline. The final thing I want to point out is that, to me, it is clear that Iran wants to demonstrate that it has tools at its disposal, that it too can pressure the United States, that the maximum pressure campaign is not a one-sided sort of effort. It's not a one-way street. And of course, it wants to gain leverage, especially if there are going to be negotiations. It's not going to kind of come back to the negotiating table with its hands in its pockets. It's going to want to get some bargaining chips ahead of time. But it's trying to do that without providing President Trump with more ammunition to, again, ramp up the pressure campaign more, or potentially to provoke some sort of direct military exchange, especially at such a sort of a crucial junction in both U.S. Domestic politics, but also in U.S.-Iran tensions. So with that, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Ariane. I'd like to invite our listeners, our viewers, to send questions in now. You can do so at policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. And we'll turn to those questions once we complete our round of discussions. I will next turn to Michael Eisenstadt, the Kahn Fellow for Military and Security Affairs at the Washington Institute, and a real expert on gray zone activities. And I'd like to invite Michael to really take us through that aspect of the strategic doctrine of Iran and its leadership, and how you view the propensity for Iran to use those familiar tools and to use that kind of environment in a more aggressive way, in a more assertive way, or do you tend to come down on the side that there is a greater degree of caution? Over to you, Mike.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Mehdi and Ari. Great comments, and I'll be building on what Mehdi and Ari said already. And I think there's a lot of consistency, I think you'll hear, between my assessment and theirs, which means either we're all right or all wrong. So, but anyhow, so if Corey, if you could just put up the graphic, please. So what I'd like to do is just walk you through, these are 3 of the 4 lines of operation of Iran's counter-pressure campaign against America's maximum pressure campaign against Iran. The 4th line of operation, which is not depicted here, is cyber, which does not really lend itself to visual, a presentation, because a lot of what happens in the cyber domain is really invisible, and we don't really get a sense of scope or duration or amplitude. But we can measure the things they're doing in the other areas. So we have one line of operation is attacks on oil transport and infrastructure, which was really kind of front-loaded, if you see, in the first 4 months or so of the counter-pressure campaign in 2019. Then you had Iran proxy attacks in Iraq, which have been continuing throughout this period, with a ramp up towards the end. A little bit more on that in a minute. And then Iran's enrichment of uranium, okay, exceeding the JCPOA caps, to the point now that they have enough low enriched uranium that if they were to further enrich it, they could have perhaps 2 nuclear weapons in 3 to 4 months, if you accept the assessment of David Albright of ISIS. So the goal was to compel the US to ease or lift sanctions while inducing the Europeans to ignore them. And they've really failed in this regard thus far. But with so little time left before American elections, they realized that it's unlikely that they're going to make any progress towards achieving the goals of the counter-pressure campaign. So now the goal is really either to not derail elections or to influence it. And I think with Donald Trump, kind of trailing at the polls, and I agree with the assessment of Ari and Mehdi that I think they would prefer to deal with the Biden administration. The goal is not to screw things up, not to do something that could alter, that could give President Trump a bump at the polls, and that could alter the outcome. Now, let me just go back here a little bit to the lines of operation depicted in this graphic here. What's interesting is you see kind of a transition or from simple to complex back to simple operations. So the first operations in the Gulf, they first targeted with limpet mines ships that were at anchor. Okay, that's very easy. The ships are not going anywhere; they're not moving. The second attack were against ships outside the Strait of Hormuz underway while they were moving. Much more complex and dangerous kind of operation. And then the third major operation was the attack on Aramco facilities in September, a complex operation using both drones and cruise missiles, attacking multiple targets, timed, coming from different directions, all arriving more or less at the same time. So simple to complex. And then they've kind of stopped the attacks on oil transport and infrastructure. A few attempts at diverting tankers, which they started in July of last year, and they did a few times, March, April period, and then August again. Then they went from also non-lethal to lethal. So the first limpet mine attacks were targeted in a way as not to cause maximum, risk to the crews. Also, a lot of the rocket attacks have been harassing attacks, not intended, at least by my assessment, to inflict casualties. Now, around the end of last year, October, November, December, and you can't see it from the graph here, you saw an increase in the numbers in the graph, but they also increased the number of rockets involved in the attacks and the caliber, the size of the rockets involved in the attack, to the point that finally in December, they ended up killing an American, okay? And then they, there was a period in January after the killing of Qasem Soleimani, as a result of a series of events that followed from the killing of the American, which was crossing of an American red line. They kind of then, February, they decreased the amount of attacks. March picked them up a bit again and killed 2 Americans and 1 Brit. Then April, May, quiet, and then a gradual ramp up since June until now. What's interesting though, if you look at the chart, you'll see August and September, dramatic increases in the number of attacks on embassy-related targets, but most of these are IED attacks, not rocket attacks. So actually in September, the number of rocket attacks, which are shown in the dark gray, has decreased. Number of IED attacks have increased dramatically. IED is improvised explosive devices against convoys. Most of the convoys hit are logistical convoys that are driven by Iraqi contractors. So in other words, they're increasing the pressure, but by targeting aspects, by targeting embassy-related targets that don't involve Americans. My read of this is their goal was to reduce tensions in the run-up to the elections while presenting a defiant front. So how do you do that? You attack Iraqis that are working, driving convoys, for the embassy. Now, of course, there was a British embassy convoy that was hit, a UN convoy that was hit, and I think a EU convoy that was hit. To my knowledge, no casualties. So, but again, not Americans. So I think what they're trying to do is, again, show a defiant face, but actually doing things that have a low chance of putting Americans at risk. I think what was a surprise is the way that the Americans responded. In a way, that's kind of the real October surprise, is the warning that we'll close down the embassy if Americans are killed. So let me just, or if the attacks, if the attacks don't stop. So, and we could talk about this during Q&A. I don't want to talk about this much right now. So what are Iran's options with the run up to the elections, okay? Again, I think an attack before November 3rd is unlikely, okay? That could be wrong, or the assessment could change, but I think they don't want to derail the things, the way things are going right now for the Trump administration. It looks like he's not, there's a good chance he won't do well at the polls. Don't screw it up, okay? There's a chance of backfiring, if you do something. That doesn't mean that they won't perhaps try something after the elections, okay? So there's a possibility that if Trump loses, they would want to kind of have a boot print on the seat of his pants on the way out in order to kind of even the score for everything they did. And that might also enable them to strengthen the hand with the Biden administration by saying, look, we're still willing to throw down the gloves if need be, or take up the gloves if need be. Now, if President Trump wins, that's a dilemma for them, because there's a question, do they do, as Mehdi said, do they put out inducements in order to get negotiations, or do they try to foment a crisis, though a crisis that is less likely to escalate if Trump wins, in order to catalyze diplomacy? And I'm not sure. I don't have a good sense of how they might play it then. So anyhow, so let me just kind of wrap things up here. The one question I have is, does U.S. threat to close down the embassy if attacks continue incentivize Iran to actually attack? And my feeling is, again, the imperative to ensure that Trump does not get reelected kind of overshadows whatever gains might be, obtained by perhaps goading the U.S. to close down the embassy. Plus, there's also a downside for Iran, because if the embassy closes down, the U.S. might not be as constrained in responding to the Iranians. That might be a signal that the U.S. is willing, during the interim between elections and the new, the swearing in of the new administration, for a period of increased U.S. activity in this period. And why risk that? I think from the Iranian point of view, also, you have the open account of the Soleimani killing and the bombing of the centrifuge assembly plant But again, revenge is subsidiary or takes a second seat to strategy. And again, election strategy, I think, overshadows all these other considerations. Plus, the last point I'll make before I wrap it up is, I've always thought that even though Iran comes out with a consistent line, they want US out of the region, they want the US to close down the embassy, I think they're actually more conflicted because, first of all, having the embassy is convenient for them because it gives them a target, okay? If the embassy closes, the US is out of Iraq. We've also said that we'll sanction Iraq if that happens. That could also harm the Iranian economy, constitute an additional blow to the Iranian economy. So I am not sure that Iran, really wants the embassy closed down. Now you might say, well, that's kind of, it would make sense that they'd want the US out. That would be a major victory for the Iranians. I would just give examples from the past that Iran has acted in seemingly contradictory ways. In the last decade, while they supported the Maliki government, they also supported militias that undermined the authority of this government, and they supported the militias that were fighting each other. Now that served Iran's interest because it ensured that they had a vital role as a mediator between all of these. But the bottom line is, again, it's very hard, to assess Iranian intentions. And I'm not sure they really want us out because, again, if ISIS makes a resurgence, it would be good to have us there to do the heavy lifting again. So the bottom line is, I'll just summarize in my closing remarks now. I think it's unlikely that they're going to try to foment a crisis before November. So November 3rd, the October surprise was the American announcement that we're going to close down the embassy unless these attacks stop. But I don't rule out the possibility that after November, there might be escalation either for Iranian or American reasons. And I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks so much, Michael. Let me remind everybody who is listening in or watching that you can send your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Let me quickly just come back to the speakers and ask a couple questions myself before I turn to the questions that are coming in from the audience. Mehdi, I'm struck by your change of analysis here from where you were not so long ago, that perhaps there was a greater appetite originally coming out of last summer on the part of Tehran to really push and pressure two of its big foes, the Saudis and then the US, to the extent that that Iran might play a role in some way of seeing the toppling of Mohammed bin Salman at the most dramatic end, or certainly Trump's defeat at the polls. How do you, is for you the big change the strike on Qasem Soleimani? Is it the social fragility that Ariane spoke to in terms of COVID and all the attendant woes that the regime is facing? How do you assess that? And do you think this greater cautiousness, holds true under any and all scenarios? I think you're still on mute.
All above reasons had played important role in changing or somehow twisting Iran's position in this regard. Don't forget that when Iran is rich and powerful, they are talking about the wiping off Israel the map. When they don't have money, they are suggesting a dialogue between civilizations. So that's Iran's, attitude. When they are weak, they are, they are not crazy, they are not suicidal. They are in their own way, they are rational. They are not self-destructive in this regard. So the COVID-19 on one hand was an important element, and their perception of Mr. Trump also was important. I think before the before the assassination of Soleimani, they had a different perception about Mr. Trump. And they didn't believe that, they believed him when he said that I'm not looking for continuing the war in the region or getting involved in a military action in the region or going on war with Iran and so on. They believed him. And they really didn't think that he would be so serious in such a way that he would assassinate Soleimani. And I think still you feel this state of shock in which Iranian leaders are living in. So I think all this made Iran more cautious, and don't forget the psychology of the society. And society doesn't accept further adventure by Islamic Republic. And I think the majority of the society are so happy that Iran's reaction to Soleimani's assassination was limited to what Iran has done. So I think all this made Iran very fragile, very in a very shaky position, placed Iran in a very shaky position. And I think everything, as my other colleagues said, depends on who's win the election and what would be the design strategy of Iran for the negotiation.
I have questions rolling in, so I'm going to turn to those now, and also urge our audience, those who have questions, send them to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. The first one, a question for any and all. In some past episodes, commentators have speculated whether Iranian operations were controlled by Tehran or initiated by sort of hot dog local commanders. Should we, and also, so how much do you worry about IRGC hotheads? First question. And secondly, should we credit reports of serious tension between the IRGC and Supreme Leader Khamenei? Mehdi or Ariane, either one of you want to take a crack at that?
Regarding the second point, there are some rumors, and always there were rumors about, the tension between the top-ranking officials of Islamic Republic, but they are just rumors. Factually, there is very little, or I haven't seen any indication that there is a tension between the top-ranking commanders of Revolutionary Guard and Ayatollah Khamenei. Ayatollah Khamenei has been seen consistently in full control of the military forces. And you can see this from rotating the commanders, making some of them just, out of power, bringing new young forces and blood into the armed forces. So I don't think that's a serious issue. Yeah, I've heard these rumors, and this is mostly Washington rumors rather than Tehran rumors.
Thank you. Ariane.
Yeah, I'll weigh in on the first question. So, there's a tendency to kind of assume that the IRGC is kind of this organization that has all these little, different units that are kind of disjointed and people do their own thing. But when it comes to really, big picture issues, strategic level issues, like US-Iran tensions, it's not just a random guard somewhere deciding to do something to poke, Rouhani or somebody else in the eye, right? I think that it is a much more sort of a, this is a unitary state acting as such. And so if Iran is making decisions to undertake the activities that we've been talking about here, or if it decides not to do those things, all of that is happening at the state level. It's happening with buy-in from different power centers, which includes the IRGC, but it's not just random commanders or random, officers sort of deciding to do their own thing. I think there is a bit of a messier command and control structure with various proxies. Some of them respond much more closely to Iran than others do. For example, Hezbollah, of course, has very, very strong and direct sort of command and control with Iran in a way that some other proxies don't. And even in Iraq, I think it's interesting to kind of look at the different Shia militias. Some of them have very close ties to Iran, respond directly to Iran, some of them much less so. But in terms of the actual IRGC proper, I think it's clear that there's strong command and control there, and it's all happening at the sort of state level.
Barbara, could I just weigh in on this, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you specifically, Michael, this issue of direction, control, et cetera, is really germane in Iraq when we consider that those shots against Erbil International Airport the other day. How do you reckon that as being just sort of the random, efforts of a militia that isn't responding to Iran versus Iran sending a signal of some kind? And there's speculation across the map on that. But
yeah. Let me just, I'll answer that. Let me just go back a little bit further in history. One thing that's impressed me is that the degree to which most of the militia activity, which is attributed to pro-Iranian, proxies in Iraq, is consistent with a certain strategic logic, which indicates to me a high degree of discipline and control. Again, I don't want to be categorical. There's always a chance of individuals. We know these groups tend to splinter, but so if you go back to after the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq in 2011, some of these groups set down red lines that if American combat troops ever came back, that would be a red line and the resistance would resume. Or if America ever reestablished bases, that would cross a red line and resistance would resume. Well, we did that after the fall of Mosul in 2014, but at that time we were co-belligerents with the Iranians in a way, fighting against ISIS, and it was in their interest to have us there to do the heavy lifting, so to speak. And their proxies did not act on the violation of their red lines, which I assume was again inconsistent with guidance from Tehran. And likewise, if you look at the more recent rocket activity and the transition between rocket attacks and IED attacks, it's all pretty consistent, and it seems to be in accordance with a certain strategic logic, which is coherent. So I would just say, again, I never rule out the possibility, especially after the killing of Soleimani. It's possible, that personal relationships are often very important in these kind of things. But there's also, look, a lot of these groups, Soleimani was the representative of the supreme leader, who is the marja of a lot of the, people in these groups. And, so the chain of command goes to Khamenei and then to God. So, in a way, the death of Soleimani should not have fractured that aspect of their command and control. Now, with regard to your question about Erbil, and I know you've raised this point that this was a signal to the Americans and the Kurds that if you close down the embassy in Baghdad, we'll follow you to Erbil if you relocate there. So don't think you'll have a clear way ahead of you. So again, there's a certain strategic logic to that. But again, getting to my point before, well, anyhow, the point about, there's often duality in Iranian behavior between their words and their actions. But the bottom line is, getting to the point that you raised here, I think the militias, the pro-Iranian proxies have shown a high degree of discipline in that, by and large, their activities almost, completely are consistent with Iranian, an Iranian strategic logic. So it's impressive.
Good, great. Another question. I have been hearing that Mojtaba Khamenei, a son of the supreme leader, is in open conflict with senior Iranian security officials as he maneuvers to be his father's successor, and that Khamenei Sr. has backed his son. Should I believe these reports? How serious is the discontent amongst security officials over this issue?
As I said, it's a Washington rumor. So.
Okay. All right. It's often said that Iran is only 2 or 3 months away from having a nuclear weapon. The JCPOA has given them little economic gain with Europe. Since they have sites that are sufficiently beyond inspection, why would they not respond to pressure if Trump is reelected by building a bomb? Threatening to build a bomb is leverage, but having one offers even more. Who will take that one?
I can take a crack at it. So just to clarify, the 2 to 3 month time frame that is often presented as not actually Iran getting a nuclear weapon that has, that can be mounted and delivered. It's the fissile material that would be used in a nuclear weapon. There's then other stages that you would have to follow in order to have an actual functioning bomb. And then after that, you then have to build an arsenal if you want to actually have a deterrent. And all of those things take a lot of time. And as Iran and other countries that have tried to proliferate and acquire nuclear weapons can tell you, it is a costly endeavor, not because it's a very expensive technology, but rather because of the cost of sanctions, international isolation, potential threats of war. And so that's part of it. The other part of it is that one of the things that remains from the JCPOA, and I think we may all have very different views of what the JCPOA did and didn't do, but one of the things that remains and that Iran has actually not sort of started violating, as far as we know yet, is the monitoring and verification, which means that the International Atomic Energy Agency does have sort of eyes on different parts of Iran's nuclear program, which again makes it a bit more complicated for it to be able to divert the material that it would need to kind of build a nuclear weapon, for example. So there's different obstacles on the way in terms of the sort of technicality, right? But I mean, I think there's been a consistent assessment by the United States and the IC and others that the main thing separating Iran from a bomb right now is not actually the technical side of things as much as it's a political decision. And that political decision, again, as far as we know from sort of the public assessments that the IC puts out pretty regularly, is that that decision has not been made, that Iran has not made the decision to actually go for a nuclear weapon. And that's been the case since, the sort of in the early 2000s when they were actually pursuing weapon-related activities in their nuclear program. Now, to me, it is a question that we don't have the answer to yet, whether or not anything that has happened over the past 2 years, whether the killing of Soleimani and everything else that has happened is changing that calculation. And I don't think we'll have the answer to that anytime soon. To me, there is certainly a possibility, and it is certainly a risk that Iran will decide at some point that, it's not that the sort of go down the North Korea path, right? That the isolation, the political isolation, the economic sanctions are all worth it to have a deterrent. But right now, we just don't have enough information to assess whether or not that decision has been made.
Great. I've got a question for Mike. Do you think that the attacks on oil infrastructure dramatically decreased after September last year due to Saudi quiet overtures and UAE's consultations with Iran on maritime security, or for another reason? Is the Saudi UAE confrontation with Iran really dying down or just lying low for the moment?
I honestly don't have the answer to that. I just don't know. Although keep in mind, anytime Iran does anything in the Gulf that has a potential for causing disruption to oil, the oil industry, they get a lot of people annoyed because there's a lot of people whose economy depends, on this. The Chinese, get more than 40% of their oil, close to 50% from the Middle East, most of it from the Gulf. So does, Japan and I think and Korea, South Korea. So, and again, there are knock-on effects in terms of potentially the world economy in terms of anything they do there. So it's the kind of thing that you don't want to, it's a good way to alienate people who are otherwise perhaps, erstwhile, kind of somewhat sympathetic to your stance. And it's possible that also that, the Emirates and the Saudi, overtures may have calmed things. That's possible. I just don't know. But I think also they realized that it just didn't work in terms of getting, sanctions eased or getting the Europeans to ignore U.S. sanctions. So I think the route that they went initially was, operations in the Gulf, non-lethal operations in the Gulf, and then, go directly to the United States in Iraq. Iraq being the place that they had the most freedom of action to operate without being criticized for violating sovereignty, because they violate Iraqi sovereignty all the time without, with impunity. And we're vulnerable. They have, good intelligence on our people there, and they could get at us directly. So, but even there, as Ariane said in her comments, they've done a lot less than they could have done. They've done this very carefully, trying to kind of incrementally put the pressure on us in order to get us to back down. So, and I think that's still their main line of effort at this point.
Well, I think that's a fair assessment. The interesting contrast between the two domains. So pressure in the Gulf, on the Gulf, and on Gulf-related energy infrastructure or shipping. Yes, it annoys a lot of people, but it didn't really produce a lot of counter responses, counter action that even in the aftermath of what by any other definition was a sort of an act of war against Saudi Arabia. It was striking how little response, not just the oil markets, but how little diplomatic or certainly no military response was forthcoming. And in Iraq, as you say, we are much more vulnerable. It is much easier for Iran to sort of disaggregate its pressures through its various fellow travelers, if you will, and it's quite difficult for us to defend against that. And so, really, the threat to pull everything down, essentially close up shop, I still come back to thinking that it has to at least hold the prospect. Well, certainly, it agitates, excites those militias who've been involved in that and those attacks. But I do keep wondering how it factors into Tehran's thinking that this may be an easy way to kind of shut the door, with the Trump administration's, active accommodation even to it on a U.S. presence altogether in Iraq.
There's one other factor that I didn't mention that may have played a role. If you remember, after the attacks in the Gulf, we set up the International Maritime Security Construct there. Our European allies also set up a parallel construct. Now, those were, General McKenzie, the head of CENTCOM, said he believed that the increased intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance activities associated with that caused the Iranians to be kind of more shy in terms of their activities at sea, because it's important for them to have deniability, and the improved reconnaissance capability would deny them that deniability. I'm not quite sure, it's quite possible that's the case, but I'll also mention that the rules of engagement for the International Maritime Security Construct allows for Americans to come to the defense of ships that are being diverted. Previously, that was not the rules of engagement, and we kind of just sat aside. So maybe the Iranians, and we also boosted our presence in Saudi Arabia after the attacks in September. So it's possible that the Iranians said, maybe their rules of engagement have changed, and that future attacks either on transport at sea or infrastructure on land might result in a U.S. response, and therefore maybe it's better to focus on softer areas where the U.S. ROE is not maybe as robust. Maybe I just put that as speculatively.
Right. There's at least a notional uptick in risk from their perspective. Hard to quantify, but at least some indication of that. I have two questions about Venezuela and essentially the Iranian tankers going to Venezuela, U.S. anger over that. So essentially an out of region, not pretext, but sort of opportunity for a flashpoint between the U.S. and Iran. Does anybody on our panel think that provides some potential for conflict? I will take that as a no.
Well, the only point I'll just say is that there have been, I think, 2 convoys involving Iranian tankers, which we have not interfered with. And the one convoy that involved, I think, Greek-owned tankers, we got to the owner and convinced him to transfer the oil. So it shows that we're not willing to directly interfere with Iranian shipping at sea. So as long as they keep using Iranian tankers, at least the precedent has been, we're not going to do anything. But if it's third country tankers, we'll do what we can to try to interfere with those transfers.
Okay.
But by non-military means.
Yeah. Question for Mehdi. How are opponents to Rouhani's administration, such as the IRGC, seek to replace him in Iran's next presidential election, positioning themselves depending on the potential outcomes to the US election?
I don't get the question exactly.
So how are opponents to Rouhani, how are they positioning themselves vis-a-vis Iran's own upcoming?
Yeah. Look, I think it's very hard to say how exactly they are going to formulate their strategy for negotiation. But one is for sure that they do believe that this is not the negotiation with, many of them even say that, the negotiation with United States itself, it's not a problem. The problem was the way Rouhani and his team negotiated with United States. So we have to negotiate with United States, provided that we get enough advantages and we get more capability to protect our interests. Their criticism is that this JCPOA was giving too much to United States and very little to Iran. So if it was the reverse, it would have been okay. So they say that they are not good negotiators. So even Zarif was accused of betraying the interest of the regime in Iran, and even giving some confidential information to United States and Israel. And this is what they say in Majlis, I mean, openly. They accused him of espionage and so on. So I think the problem is who's gonna negotiate. They believe that we are in a better place to protect the interests of it.
So we're ticking down to the last 2 or 3 minutes here, and I think this will have to be the final question. How do the treaties with UAE and Bahrain with normalization with Israel change Iran's strategic outlook? Does it in any way, does normalization in any way curtail the Iranians? Does it in some sense, from their perspective, bring the Israelis to Iran's border? And I'd like, if I could ask each of you to offer a comment on that. Ariane, can I start with you?
Sure. I mean, look, I think that it definitely shows that Iran is much more isolated in its region than it had been in the past, right? And going back to the question that was posed, that Mike answered about the sort of what seemed like a brief moment of rapprochement between the UAE and Iran, well, it seems unlikely to me that we'll see the I mean, I think that the UAE has its own interests with Iran, and they're complex, and they're, you know, the UAE has never really fully cut off ties with Iran the way some other countries in the region have. But it certainly doesn't seem to me that they will be as eager to continue that sort of rapprochement with Iran now that they're able to project a sort of united front in the region. So I think that the isolation is acutely felt by Iran. On the other hand, I think that it also is seen perhaps as a good way for Iran to be able to kind of present itself as the last line of resistance in the region, right? You have all these prominent, you know, big Arab Muslim countries that are kind of, you know, that are building a relationship openly, formally, formalizing ties that have been deepening for a number of years now. And so that essentially means that Iran can kind of take the mantle of the resistance and be the sort of champion of the anti-Israeli movements in the region. And so I think it's both potentially seen as an opportunity, but also, of course, as a challenge by Iran.
But perhaps something to be dealt with after US elections.
Certainly, I don't think that it is something that is going to be, again, going back to all of the points we've made so far, I think that it is seen as sort of a, you know, ongoing, long-term issue, and not something that should come between Iran and the US, or at least between preserving the status quo until November. I think Mike said something to this effect, that what happens between November and January is actually much more concerning to me than what happens between now and November. But it is 2020, so you know we're all proven wrong all the time.
More surprises. Mehdi,
Exactly.
if I could ask you to offer your thoughts on this question and also the two questions now, because I was going to get to that even though we're just ticking over 12, but it's that normalization question, and then we focused on October surprise, but is there perhaps more room for greater uncertainty and risk-taking post November 3rd? Over to you.
I think ideologically it was a disaster for Islamic Republic, and the only reason Ayatollah Khamenei could call himself the leader of world's Muslims, it was because of the Palestinian cause. And without that, without this animosity with Israel, he couldn't be the leader of Muslim world. The whole pan-Islamic ideology of Islamic Republic is based on its anti-Israeli stance. And any fragmentation in Arab world or Muslim world with regard to Israel would seriously harm that. So in terms of Iran's soft power in Islamic world or in Arab world, it was a big, big disaster. And I don't think that Iran would be by any means in a position to restore the previous position they had with regard to Arab.
And you're thinking about risk factors in that period between our elections and the seating of a new administration or a second term?
I think Iran would be very cautious. No, I don't see in look as I said in last 24 hours. More than 220 people have died due to coronavirus. So people are so angry. People do not expect any kind of conflict or surprise, especially caused by Iran. Okay.
And Michael, if I can ask you to have the last words.
Yeah, the only thing I'll just, I have nothing to add with regard to the other points about the UAE. I don't have a good sense of that. The only thing I'll just talk about is the domestic external linkages. One thing that's impressed me in the past, although this situation right now might be kind of sui generis, but in the past, Iran's external behavior hasn't, at least in my mind, been affected by domestic circumstances. And so I don't see it actually a linkage, a positive linkage or a negative linkage. So you had in December 2017, January 2018, domestic unrest. And among the slogans were, not for Palestine, not for Syria, my life is only for Iran. 2 months later, Iran attempted an attack with a drone against Israel, which kind of escalated things in Syria between Israel and Iran. So even though, this very factor had been a, part of the domestic unrest a couple of months before, it didn't affect their external behavior. And then likewise, Iran ramped up rocket attacks in Iraq in November, December of last year at the time when you had the gas riots. Actually, the ramping up started a little bit before, and the gas riots really didn't affect their ramp up. And then finally now you had with the COVID, they're still doing stuff in, ramping up in Iraq, although in a way to minimize, I think, the potential for conflict. So what's impressed me is the degree to which, the people who do these external operations really aren't affected by domestic politics, because in their eyes, a lot of the people who are fed up with the regime are people who are, West toxified, or they've not bought into the values of the revolution, so screw them, So, but again, maybe the COVID has gotten so bad that, the Supreme Leader tells them, not now, and maybe the elections also have an impact on it.
If I may, now, especially after what happened with COVID-19 and the assassination of Soleimani, now the problem is not with opposition. It's not with people who do not like Islamic Republic, or even if people who dislike Khamenei himself. No, the problem is that with those loyal layers of the population to Islamic Republic, and Ayatollah Khamenei is afraid of losing them.
Great. Well, I think that's a good point to draw this discussion to a close on. And I'll just remind our panelists and our viewers that there are still many more days to come before October is over, before the elections are upon us. 28 days, I think. So there's still room for a few surprises. But on the other hand, whatever comes on November 3rd, I think it's suffice to say we will still be in a zone of uncertainty with Tehran, given all the factors that we've discussed today and the factors that lie between the US and Iran. Thank you so much, Ariane, Michael, and Mehdi. It was a great discussion, and I think we'll certainly have to book another one in November.
Stay healthy, everybody.